Hello, my name is Jerry Elger. I'm the Assistant Managing Editor at ASHRAE Journal. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, part of the ASHRAE Journal Supplier Webinar Series. The series provides information to ASHRAE Journal readers and to others about products and technology of interest to industry professionals. ASHRAE does not review supplier webinar presentations. The following presentation has been prepared by Trane. The subject is Building Automation Systems and Cybersecurity. Today's speakers are Brian Myers, Mangaya Shivananam, and Glenn Gassman. Brian is a Senior Product Manager within the Controls Products team at Trane. Mangaya is the Principal Cybersecurity Architect at Trane Technologies, and Glenn is the Embedded Software and Cybersecurity Leader within the Trane Commercial Business Unit of Trane Technologies. Brian, the microphone is all yours.
I wanted to start, by thanking everybody for joining us today. We've got a very nice turnout, and we appreciate you spending the hour with us. I also wanted to start out with a set of learning objectives that we'll cover today. The first thing that we're going to start with is really the benefit behind a modern control system and the things that owners are looking for and ultimately can realize with a modern control system. And let's start with the why. As we get a little bit further into the conversation, we'll transition to some of the key risk factors. Modern control systems are deployed in environments today that are very different than what they were 30, 20, even 5 years ago. There are risk factors today that we couldn't have even imagined 30 years ago. And so we want to understand the key risks that we face from ultimately realizing the benefits that customers are looking for. We're going to spend some time talking about some methods that we can use for teaming around cybersecurity to ultimately make this an easier process on all of us and to make us collectively more productive. If we are not aligned in efforts and sharing conversations, we're going to fight each other, right? And those gaps will ultimately be exploited by the bad guys. At the very end, we'll explore just a little bit of coming soon. You'll hear about a couple of emerging technologies that will certainly become specifiable at the product and solution level that you may have already heard about, but we'll give a few thoughts in terms of what's next there. And then, before I transition into the meat of the conversation, I want to encourage you guys to answer or ask questions, into the Q&A chat as they come to you. We certainly will reserve a fair bit of time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. It's oftentimes hard to remember what you thought about on slide 3 by the time that we get to slide 25. And so along the way, I would encourage you to go ahead and type in the questions, and we'll do our best to queue those up and get you an appropriate and meaningful answer as we move forward. All right, so if we take a look at kind of these new opportunities, modern control systems provide a significant set of opportunities that owners can ultimately realize directly. And then there's a core component of indirect benefits that they receive from their servicing contractors. And so if we take a look at essentially what owners are looking at today, right? You've all seen a version of this slide for years, but the core idea of a modern control system and the connectivity that goes with it really allows the building owners, right, to realize the benefits of technology to improve business outcomes. If you think about the balance of occupant comfort and energy efficiency, throw into that mix the core idea of indoor air quality and ventilation optimization that's come up as a result of the pandemic over the last 18 months. By having an ability, right, to manage these systems in a consistent, standard way, they're able to realize real-time business benefits as a result. They're also able to gain more information to help them essentially make operational decisions that, again, improve business outcomes, whether it be productivity or energy spend or other items that they're looking for. Another item that certainly they're looking for is documentation of results to their stakeholders. And so a modern system allows just a unprecedented level of information that we can use to make decisions, as well as document ultimately the outcomes of those decisions. Another item that is fairly obvious, right, but took on kind of a new meaning over the last 18 months in the midst of a global pandemic when everybody like myself has been working from their basement or, sometimes in the office, sometimes remote. This idea of secure remote access, being able to, from any device, anywhere in the world, be able to reach back into their system and still be productive, even if they're not able to sit right next to a workstation that they historically have relied on. On the indirect side, there are some significant opportunities here. If you think about reliability, a connected system can bring out new ideas of remote service, right, where we can troubleshoot systems without ever having to roll a truck. We can throw analytics at data and identify patterns or identify failures before they become obvious in a space. That is a constantly emerging space, right? There's artificial intelligence. There's a whole lot of other things that are emerging there. But the core ideas around increased reliability, decreased downtime, the improvement of servicing, being able to remotely triage systems. And so there's a wealth of capabilities that are opened up by a modern control system when they're done right. Now, one of the interesting things that has played out, right, and one of the things that we'll discuss pervasively through today is this commonly known as the IT-OT gap. There's been this idea of a convergence for some time. The IT systems have been a separate island from the OT systems. Once in a while they intersect, right, where an OT system is deployed on an IT network, but the teams don't really interact. They don't have common goals, right? Those types of things that really prevent ultimately everybody from working towards a common level of goals and being successfully ultimately as they go forward. If you take a look at the slide here, this is a set of data that came out from a recent study of operational technology professionals. It was done by Fortinet. It's entitled 2021, The State of Operational Technology and Cybersecurity. There's a couple of really meaningful data points on this slide that I want to make sure that people understand. Number one is the pandemic, right? In the views of these OT professionals, for 71% of these professionals, the pandemic accelerated their efforts at converging IT and OT systems. For another, 61% of those folks, they don't anticipate that acceleration is going to go away. They expect to continue it after the pandemic. 8%, expect or anticipate that it will remain where they put it, right, after they accelerated it. But there's a very small number of folks here in this OT professional group that are looking to go back to the way things were. Right? There's significant benefit. There were expenditures that were maybe unplanned but necessary that had driven the acceleration here. The other thing in the bottom right-hand corner that I want to call your attention to is the OT professionals and their opinions on the importance of cybersecurity solutions. Two very meaningful items that come out of 2020 to 2021. Number one is there's a 14% drop in the item all the way over to the right in the thought that these cybersecurity solutions impede operational flexibility. In other words, they're starting to get to this acceptance stage of it's something they need to get behind. It's not going away, right? And let's use it to our advantage. Conversely, the biggest increase was around creation of business concerns. Right? These operational technology folks are having to deal with things like vulnerability disclosures and patches and making sure that they've got a plan for maintaining systems. And so they're coming to the realization that there are business concerns here that they need answers for. And so there's a whole lot wrapped up in here, right? But I wanted to kind of hammer home to start with the idea, right, that these technologies have been coming together for quite some time for a really distinct benefit, and the pandemic only accelerated it, right? And so we now have this component where we have to react in terms of how we see the risks, how we work to partner on the risks, and ultimately what we do for our next several steps. And so with that being said, I'm going to pass the microphone to Mangaya for a few slides here.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I wanted to say the connectivity comes with a price. While there are significant opportunities, which Brian mentioned, that came up for the past area, the latest building operating system and technology advancements, the new risk always surfaced, which was not in the past, where we had the air gap systems and then deployment scenarios. Here are some of the few facts which I have been listed here, which it helps us understand the scale and the severity of the problem we are discussing here. So you could see certain numbers and dollar rates there, which has been listed from the various studies here. I just want to highlight more importantly is like 2,935,000 public breaches have been done in last 2020. It's a huge number, and this is not just exclusively an IT problem anymore, because according to the studies, it says that more threats are surfacing for ICS and our OT systems. It's been more than tripled in over the year because of the more connectivity and more remote connections and non-air gap system and more integration with IT and OT network, because the difference in these two networks are converging at one point that causes all these issues. So it's more important because we wanted to highlight about it is the most important here with ICS and OT system, because they are the weakest link on the network, at the same time it's an easy entry point for an attacker to intrude into a customer network. So one best example which happened recently is I wanted to highlight is like the Colonial Pipeline attack, where the hacker gained the entry point via the network through the VPN, the virtual private network account, which is being given for the employees for the remote access. So it's a huge deal here because of the connectivity we are opening up. So it's very important for us to pay attention to it. So our intention is not to scare anyone, but rather to convey the magnitude of the problem and the number of people staying up all night to figure out how to address these problems. This will impact our collective work here. So in the past, there were a lot of handful of years where there are a lot of handful of regulatory regulations have been passed, cyber laws, and everything came up. So it started with the GDPR. Everybody's familiar with the with the privacy one, and it didn't stop right there. There were a lot of California came up with their Privacy Act, and then the California came up with the connected devices, and Oregon had one, and the list keeps on growing, and we have more state regulations and state statutes coming soon, more like China and UK having their own cyber laws, and New York is going to propose a new bill for critical infrastructures. So it's all aligning with the executive order we'll be talking later. So the one key point which I wanted to highlight here, these regulations are very hyper-localized and are difficult to scale to the project across the world. Because the reason why I say is that each project has been remained a bit different from the next one. So it's hard for us to correlate everything and have a one unique solution there. But it's worth mentioning here is in these regulations, the few best practices align across all these regulations globally, some around access controls, some around the network isolation, securing the credentials, and more around the regular software and firmware update. So it's very important for us to stay ahead on these things, because it's the more and more, since we are evolving in the space and it's totally new to the industry and totally new to our customers, there are a lot of customers' questionnaires and concerns are arising in this area. I'm passing out to Brian here.
Thanks, Mangaya. So, with everything that Mangaya just said, right? Mangaya, can I ask that you go ahead and chat or mute yourself, please? All right. With everything Mangaya just said, right, it's clear that if you heard, right, she talked about the Colonial Pipeline hack in May, and that happened in early May. All of these regulations and these requirements and all of the work that people have been trying to do with IT questionnaires and put in place best practices, it's not enough. It's not slowing the pace of incidents. You saw some of the stats. You saw that Dragos had identified that the operational technology exploits or attacks tripled last year. And so the Colonial Pipeline kind of brought us to a head. And so if you look at what happened there, it shut down a very strategic, important pipeline between Florida and Texas, which is actually the #1 pipeline for refined oil in the country. And that gives pause, right? When you have people that can't get gas, when you have industry that can't get what they need, right, to conduct business, right, to drive, to do those things that just are daily life, that actually led to a presidential state of emergency. And ultimately, within 5 days of that hack, we had a presidential executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity. There's 3 major points, right, that I want to take away here. I would encourage you to go check out the link on the right-hand side, read it. It's dense, it's laced with terms and acronyms. If you have interest, it might speak to you. But the 3 major takeaways that I wanted to highlight for today's presentation is #1, this idea of incremental bite-by-bite, things like Oregon having a statute or California having a statute. That's not going to give us what we need. The president is identifying that we need to make bold changes. We need to make significant investments. And it has to be a top-down strategy instead of bottoms-up. The second thing that he calls out very clearly here is that the scope of this protection and security isn't just information technology. It's not traditional IT systems. He specifically calls out that this is operational technology as much as it is informational technology. That's industrial control systems. That is us, right? That is our group, right? We're being called out there as a core part of this to make sure that we have a cohesive plan as a country. He also calls out a very important idea, right? He can compel the federal government to do certain things for its suppliers, its relationship manufacturers, et cetera. But he calls out, right, the need to have a public-private partnership and really attack this on both sides. And so there are some explicit items that are being asked here around the improvement of product standards, right? Whether that is actually taking NIST standards or other standards that are already in the public space and testing against them and benchmarking them to make it easier to specify or deploy product. That is a part of the executive order. The second thing is on vulnerability disclosures. This is an area that IT industry is very familiar with. They're very familiar with disclosing vulnerabilities through something like the ICS CERT part, through the Department of Homeland Security's CISO organization. That's not consistent. It's not consistent in all industries. It's not consistent across our industry. And so you're going to start to see more and more standardization around what to communicate, where to communicate it to, helping people understand, right? Not just the federal government, but customers understand where they sit in terms of risk and what they should do about it. You're also going to see some improved contract language. As you look at historical specifications and contracts, they're just filled with gaps, right? Whose responsibility is it to talk to the IT staff proactively and get their requirements? Whose responsibility is it to maintain the system after the warranty period, right? Who's going to come out and do patches? Who's going to come out and make sure that if there is one of those vulnerability disclosures, that somebody actually has it in their purview, someone is responsible to come out and do the update in a period of time that is specified contractually. The other thing that you're going to see is, as you shine a light on these types of things, what inevitably happens is people find more and more gaps, right? The top handful are certainly called out in the executive order, but as other conversations happen, more gaps will certainly be identified with, hopefully, more solutions that are a part of both the private and public sector. We're going to have to work on this together to effectively get it right. I'll transition back to Mangaya for the next couple of slides here.
Thank you, Brian. So the previous slides painted a picture of rapidly changing environment that is difficult for us to work with. However, we also have highlighted consistent way to improve the risk mitigation that are available today if we share a common best practice here. The let's start with the NIST cybersecurity framework. NIST has been the leader in the development of cybersecurity standards and has a broad participation of private and public sectors as well as academia too. You can follow the link below if you want to learn more about the framework. So if you see the picture there are 5 core concepts which outline the framework. The one is to identify the asset and its risk, and then protect the asset, and then the third one is to detect the incoming threats in the network or in the system level. And then the fourth one is to respond and deter to contain the problem. And then the last one is from the recovery part, where the system is to support the business disaster recovery as well as business continuity. Because this is the core where it's very important for us to focus on all these different aspects to make sure we provide a very secure environment as well as we are very resilient in our response there. But I have to highlight the 2 important concepts here to touch in this framework. Is primarily the first one is there's no single person owns all these elements, right? That's very important here. To be successful, we must team up. So that's important. The second concept is these are all the living documents. When I say living documents, it doesn't mean the frame is going to change, but the implementation and then the actions, the plan of action might change depending upon all the state regulations and the different statutes we were talking about, and that constantly evolving threats and threat landscapes and etc. So it is always a living document, so it's constantly evolving. So it's important for us to transform the series of transaction events, what we do. When I say what we do, in the terms of installation, in the terms of upgrading our system, in the terms of replacement of our system from a legacy to the new, and more on the upgrading process, and also to have a very clear defined plan of action to include and identify an ongoing ownership for all these activities we have been discussing here. So it's very important. So the primary key takeaway here is to share the initiative and the ownership between the IT and OT team, which we are lagging today, and it's very crucial for the success going forward with the constantly evolving cyber changes. With that, I will hand out to Brian.
Thanks, Mangaya. So, one of the important things that I want to get on before we start talking about best practices and what we can do about it, right? We don't want to paint you with a grim picture and then just punt, right? Good luck. And so we want to make this tactical and define some best practices and some things that you can do to help both your customers if you're a consulting engineer, or you could certainly help yourself if you're a customer. Or I know there are some manufacturers listening as well, and how we can work together, right, to collectively improve the state of the situation. And so let's talk about historic challenge, right? This is probably one of the biggest challenges that we have. I'm loosely calling it teaming, right? But just the scope of work, the players involved. Typically a lot of our work is done through project specifications, and those are really heavily focused on operational technology. They're focused on what the building controller is going to do, how it's going to communicate to the equipment controllers, which protocols it's going to use, what the users are going to be able to do, what the graphics look like. In many cases, they don't specify a whole lot for the IT requirements, right? They're not talking about which ports have to be locked down or shut down, or how the controllers have to be hardened, or the security audits or updates. A lot of times those are just simply absent, right? They fall by the wayside. They're not a part of a project on a new installation, and maybe we put it off for when and if a service agreement comes to play. But a lot of times that just simply doesn't happen. And so now if you fast forward a little bit to the control system installers, they're very reluctant historically to engage IT, right? They engage them when they need something. I've talked to many of these folks, right? I personally affectionately refer to the IT staff as the Department of No. I don't mean that to be derogatory, but they have a very specific charter in life, right? And that is to enable people and to prevent risk. And So as you think about this, right, the control system installers go talk to the IT staff when they need a network drop, if they need a static IP address, if they need a protocol capture, so they need a port mirrored, if they need a new virtual or physical server, but they only engage when they absolutely have to. And so the net result is it wasn't in the specification, we're not having upfront conversations. We have a lot of important gaps that typically remain on these projects. I mentioned the IT requirements. A lot of times those IT requirements are discovered after the project has been sold or when it's in the process of being deployed, because now you go ask for a static IP address and a whole lot of questions start to be asked. And so not having the upfront conversation leaves that gap. Another gap that is really obvious, right, is system maintenance. If you look at the firmware and software deployment process, it's very common for manufacturers to put patches out and put them on a download site and not ever have them actually deployed on a controller on a customer site. That presents a challenge for us. A third item that's very common on the IT side is auditing of these systems, right? Are you at a current version of software? Are you where you should be? Let's look at the firewalls and make sure that there aren't any open ports that are exposing things to the internet unnecessarily. How about user credentials? I get an email every 90 days telling me that I must change my password, or 14 days from now, I will not be able to log into the system, right? That's a very common thing on the IT side, yet on the OT side, right, we have a challenge, right? Because a lot of times those are deployed at the outset of the project, and no one ever comes back and changes the passwords. They're put onto Post-it notes. They're passed from technician to technician or from technician to customer, and so that becomes a challenge. The fourth item here that I would highlight as a gap is vulnerability or incident response. So as I talk through those ICS certs or the communication from a vendor that there's a gap or a vulnerability that, maybe it isn't even being exploited, how does someone know that they need to take action? How does someone know that they have responsibility to look at that cert, identify that they have product in their facility, and deploy it? If the IT team is looking at the certs and the facility team has no concept of what a cert is, how do we bridge that gap? And then this last item that's a little bit more vague, right, a little bit more future state, as systems are deployed and the environment that they're used in is dynamically changing over time, right, the IT staff is coming into this cybersecurity world and there's constant evolution. They're looking at things like zero trust. You can't just plug in any PC to an Ethernet port. You need to validate that you have a right to be there. As BACnet SC, Secure Connect, comes to fruition, are the controllers that are already in place upgradable? If so, is that a new project? Is that something that will wait until the next chiller gets installed? Do we have to wait to get a new system controller? Who's got the dollars to do it? It's necessary update, it's necessary evolution, but there's a lot of gaps around ownership of IT versus the facility management folks. If we transition, to kind of how a little bit of the how we attack this. We've tried to break things out into 4 buckets to kind of frame the next handful of slides. The first is around teaming, right? We've talked a little bit about the challenge of not teaming. We'll describe a couple of things that really should happen in that vein. Secure product. We'll talk about what that means and maybe why it's a little bit more difficult than just a stamp on a controller. We'll talk about installation practices, right? These are applied systems in most cases. Just having a single secure product isn't enough, right? How do we manage the firewalls and how do we manage the VLANs and all those kind of things? And then lastly, we'll talk about maintenance, right? This is controller life cycle and planning for the maintenance, planning for vulnerabilities and how we react there. Let's transition to this concept of teaming, right? I don't want to leave the impression that we only need to team with IT and facility managers, right? But those are 2 of the very important relationships that we're going to have to make, right, collectively for us to be successful here. I want to start with the IT staff. Right? The IT staff, I affectionately called them the Department of No in the past, right? Part of the Department of No comes from the fact that we don't always do a really good job of communicating why we need something from them, right? We need to be very clear in the case of remote access that, yes, I understand it would be more secure to put a BAS controller in a closet, lock the closet, and never connect an Ethernet controller into it. However, that's going to mean that a facility manager or maybe 2 facility managers that are responsible for 10 different schools in a school district, that's going to mean they've got to drive to every one of those facilities, enter the locked cabinet, plug in a cable, and take an action. That's not a really viable thing. It hinders greatly the productivity of those systems. And so if we can communicate the why to the IT staff, the next discussion becomes the how. Right? They're going to want to know the protocols, the technology. They're going to want to know terminology and diagrams that make sense to them. IT has a little bit of their own lingo, their own terminology, and we've got to find ways to enable our BAS installers to meet the IT staff where they are. If we come in and we look blank when the IT staff asks what type of encryption protocol we're using, or is it 256-bit versus 128, or do you support 802.1x Ethernet authentication? If we have a BAS installer sitting in front of that IT staff with no idea how any of that works or what any of it means, we've already failed. And so it's really incumbent on us to enable our technicians, our project managers, our sales folks to communicate to the consulting engineers and these partners on the IT side what we're asking for, right, the why, and how we're going to do it in a way that makes sense to them. It lives up to their base level of requirements. The last thing I'll highlight here is we want to proactively make sure we're talking to facility managers. They need to understand that these systems, you can't just buy and leave it in a mechanical room for the next 30 years until you replace the chiller. That worked in the early days of DDC. That doesn't work today in the modern control environment where there are cybersecurity vulnerabilities, there's mobile phone access, there's remote access through through web interfaces. We have to make sure they understand that there's maintenance that has to happen here, whether they own it or they partner with the IT staff to maintain, is really not of a ton of concern to us. We just need to know that somebody owns it, and we need the facility managers to continue to carry that torch. Let's transition just a little bit to project specifications. Specifications I highlighted earlier are very commonly missing some of these components. I want to highlight a couple of things that we can do to really improve things on the specification side. First, I would like to advocate, right, that as we define these, I just told you that we had to do a little bit of the why, right, the remote access that helps with productivity, as well as the how, right, things like, oh geez, but while you do that, don't go forward ports or expose ports on the internet because that creates a world of pain for the cybersecurity compliance folks. And so if we take a look at that same scenario, the remote access, the bubble on the left, right, is a pretty common thing that I would expect to see in a specification. The project's controls contractor shall provide remote access to a building automation system, right? Mobile phones, web interfaces, et cetera, remote access is expected. If you look at the next two blurbs, these are a little bit of the how. VPNs have commonly been used in this space. VPNs are challenging for a couple of reasons. They're challenging for servicing contractors because they may need a different VPN client and a different authentication for every individual customer they happen to service. That's a pain. We also have a challenge on the owner side or the facility manager side where the VPN client tools that are expected to be used may not function on their phones or their tablets or their other devices that they happen to use. It may work on the one PC that they happen to have, right, or the laptop that they happen to have, and that again is cumbersome. It doesn't work with the technology that they'd like it to work with. And so if you transition to the far right side, right, there's another control. We wouldn't want to just fall back and say VPN is hard and it's challenging, so go ahead and expose a port or forward a port to the BAS and put it on the internet. Well, now you have challenges with the controller wasn't patched, there might be vulnerabilities. Sites like Shodan and Census make these easily findable, right? Make the bad guys, right? They give kind of the bad guys a leg up. And so we want to make sure that if we start with that remote access as something that's needed, we also talk a little bit about the how. And those how are contractual things that we can do in our commissioning process to make sure that we leave the site secure in a manner that works with the customer's expectations. I want to encourage you lastly on this slide, these are things that are changing rapidly. We talked about all the upfront work and the changing regulations and changing laws and changing executive orders. And so as these change, it can sometimes be really hard to keep up on this. I would encourage you to go check out a tool like Trane Design Assist that can help you with up-to-date versions of the guide specifications, right, that will help you with this language of the why and the how. Not advocating for this specific tool, but certainly tools like this can help you stay abreast of a changing environment. All right, let's transition to secure product. This is kind of the next stage. After we've gotten to the teaming and some of the upfront contracting, we want to get to, I think everyone on the call would agree that secure product is a foundation, right? This is something that we have to start with for securely deployed BAS. The problem is secure is a very subjective term. There's not a BTL, BACnet Test Labs type mark for security, right? There are 100 different standards on cybersecurity and many different protocols, and it's a very difficult thing, right, to pinpoint down in terms of this product is secure. So there are things that are going to come out later. We'll talk about in a couple of slides here, things like BACnet Secure Connect, which are specifiable technologies that should be interoperable, that will allow vendors to communicate in a secure manner, that will work seamlessly in the IT environment. We can spec that right as soon as it's ready to go. But that still isn't going to be a silver bullet. We have to align with the IT staff early to understand their input into the process, to understand what they deem is secure. A lot of times specific customers may have questionnaires, and those questionnaires may go through specific levels of encryption or protocols that have to be shut off or ports that have to be closed. And so we want to make sure we engage up front to make sure that whatever the definition of secure product is, it is given to us largely from the IT staff. The last item that I'll highlight here is, a lot of these features are complex. I talked a little bit about, the challenge of a BAS contractor or a controls installer communicating with the IT staff. It's almost like they speak two different languages. And so it's really important to look to out-of-box solutions that can reduce the common mistakes, that can help us put together a brochure on standardization of the why we need remote access, what it does for us, and the how we do it. So a lot of these things, right, these are examples below of some things that we've done in Trane product to really simplify things and package it to eliminate the on-site discovery or the on-site engineering that has to happen to be able to deliver these secure products. And so again, not advocating for these specific features, right, but the idea of simplifying the implementation of this so that we meet all of the IT checkboxes of the right encryption, the right protocols, right, but we make it a simple checkbox thing for the folks that are on the site to actually go implement. I mentioned earlier, that product isn't enough, right? We've teamed together, we've done some secure product, but these are all applied systems. Every site is a little bit different. And so there are some best practices that we really need to fall back on. These can certainly be specified. These are items that, are really important to the overall security of the system. Things like restricting the physical controller, right? We shouldn't have people that are untrained or not authorized to use these systems plugging into them. And so that's a fairly obvious one. The second one, if you look at the isolation of the controls, we want to isolate the controls from other building systems or other enterprise systems that they have no business communicating to. We also want to isolate from the internet. I talked about closing down those external ports. We don't want these controllers on the internet. We don't want these controllers to somehow be able to access a point of sale register at a retail location. We need to use VLANs. We need to use firewalls to kind of keep a tight level of control around the communications for these controllers. When we use remote access, right, I've highlighted this a couple times, we don't want to have exposed or forwarded firewall ports. That's a recipe for very bad things to happen. I also highlighted the secure user credentials. Right? We don't want to have the passwords of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 because it's convenient, right? Or the slightly more complex password that's on a Post-it note that's on a monitor that everyone has. We want to encourage secure credentials through password managers, right? Through a lot more standard IT best practices that will help people manage the complexity of easy to use and complex. That will also help us with the shared passwords, right? The passwords that are passed around from tech to tech or from office to office or contractor to contractor. Those are just, again, a recipe for problems. The Colonial Pipeline hack that Mangaya talked through was 100% someone found credentials they shouldn't have, used TeamViewer to access the site, and bad things happened. The last thing that I'll highlight is even if we do all of these things right, right? We have to make sure that we've got a well-documented process with an owner to keep the system up to date. It is critically important, right? I set my iPhone on my nightstand as I go to bed. It updates itself. I'm not suggesting that we'll get to that level, right, in the near future in mechanical systems, but that's the world we're living in, right? There's a reason that that is the paradigm we're living in. And so as I transition to the maintenance of firmware and software versions, it's really important to call out, right? On the consumer side, we're all used to this. I don't care if you use Microsoft Windows or Mac OS, you've got an iPhone or an Android, even a Tesla car will update itself overnight while someone is sleeping, right? And the core idea here is that these systems or these solutions for updates eliminate the active user ownership, right? They don't require people to go in and do anything other than maybe click yes, right? Now that's a really hard thing to implement in a commercial environment for a lot of reasons, right? Contractual reasons, access reasons, do we have remote connectivity? What is on the other mechanical side of this? Am I controlling a chilled water loop that is serving an operating room or a production environment? And so it's a little bit harder, right? The easy part is on the manufacturer to produce an upgrade, right? We produce an update, we produce a security patch, we put it on a download site, then what? This is where, you know, the advocacy here is to use specifications and drive contract terms that have a clear understanding of controller life cycles. Right? The controller life cycle is not the life of the chiller. It is not put a controller in the wall and 30 years later you're going to replace it. We're living in a world where, regardless of the manufacturer, these devices are closer to smartphones than they are to chillers. And so we have to have an understanding of how long both the hardware will be supported and the software within it. The other two items really are around ownership, right? I talked through the ownership and the plan. Equally as important is probably dollars, right? Is there budget to go do this work? Sometimes it requires someone to show up to a site and do a checkout and do an update and then do a checkout on the backside to make sure that it was successful. Are there dollars there, right? Is there someone who's responsible for it? And then the last item that's directly related to that is, what about the maintenance intervals? You know, how often are we doing these? Is it just once a quarter? Is it once a year? Is it on Saturday nights from midnight to 4 because that's when it won't impact production? We've got to be really clear, right, with customers what their expectations are around when we can perform these absolutely essential updates. Megaya.
Oops. Thanks, Brian. Brian covered a lot of best practices and procedures, what you want to consider here. But some certain things we have to highlight here on the vulnerability is because software vulnerabilities are realities. So thus the environment of these systems operate are not static. So the continuous monitoring and improvement is mandated. There are standard set of that's the standard communication principles for vulnerability also. So I wanted to highlight a couple items here. One is the ICS cert. ICS cert is a standard practice followed by the industry to disclose vulnerabilities and mitigation practices, best practices to resolve those issues. It's owned by CISA and governed by Department of Homeland Security, and it's also mandated in the presidential order, which Brian mentioned earlier, which talks about all the businesses which has federal business need to make sure we disclose all these vulnerabilities. So considering the fact that constantly changing software, it is important for us to stay ahead to ensure we patch and maintain our network properly. So the one key principle I wanted to talk here about is the defense in depth. So it is necessary strategy where we focus on the physical, technical, and endpoint security. So when it comes to the physical, it's like more on the access control, physical access restrictions, or how we handle those things. On the technical side, we look for more on the firewall. I think Brian talked about behind the firewall. Do not expose your devices to the internet. It's very important, and mostly making sure we have a secure DMZ and VPN set up on our OT network network, because the reason we insist this again here is it is important, because the more and more connected we are, the more we are not an isolated network anymore. We are one of the part of the IT network, so it is crucial for us to make sure we have all these best practices. And then another one is the network isolation, VLANs, firewalls, and other things too. The last piece on the defense in depth we wanted to cover is the endpoint security. So endpoint security is crucial because our system is functioning on its own and it's self-sufficient to do a lot of functionality, and it is easier entry point to make sure it has been escalated, and also an attacker can use this as an entry point to access the upstream devices as well as the downstream devices. So hardening the system is very crucial. When I say hardening the system, patching them up to date, securing the ports, and constantly updating them, and then following up with the vulnerability management. So it is crucial for us to make sure we monitor as a system, so overall we meet the IT best practices and administrative controls to have a successful deployment site in the field. So that's the key here is ownership and collaboration with IT and facility manager to ensure we reduce and address all these vulnerabilities for the future. With that, I'm going to hand out to Glenn.
Thank you very much, Magaya. So far you've heard about the needs for increased connectivity, needs for secure remote access, changing landscape of risks and regulations, the convergence of IT and OT, promoting opportunities for teaming between IT and OT, including the need for manufacturers to provide security updates, and those system owners need to keep those devices patched and up to date. So the security journey continues, and I'm going to cover this, emerging cybersecurity standard. Hopefully this advancement will remove the subjectivity of the definition of secure and provide a means to be collectively secure. So with many of you would be aware of BACnet SC, but unlike classic BACnet, BACnet SC is a technique for BACnet messaging that is secure, meaning that it employs accepted IT practices for security. Think TLS 1.3. Content is strongly encrypted and works across firewalls. You'll have recognized that the addendum is published, and since it is part of the standard, I believe we would then refer to it as the standard. And while a few gaps exist to interoperability, such as the BACnet test lab validation process, encryption certificate management, there is work in progress. BACnet SC is the future of BACnet, and it is important to understand that most manufacturers will be able to deploy this solution to modern building automation systems with a software update. Note that there is a BACnet Secure Connect Interoperability Acceleration Program that is supported with broad commitment from manufacturers, and there is a partial list of participating members that can be found at the link on the side of this slide. As we move forward, the challenge is hybrid networks, interoperability with all devices while conforming to IT standards and governance. To overcome this, the industry is exploring managed BACnet, an industry-wide interoperable standard. If you take a look at that diagram, this is just a sample of what a managed BACnet network of the future would look like. You would have your devices, your non-BACnet devices talking to a BACnet gateway. You might have your BACnet IP, MSTP devices talking to a managed router, all consolidated up to a managed BACnet appliance, all part of the IT infrastructure with legitimate areas where remote access will be permitted. When you're supporting multi-site, you would have a BACnet management console, or a console that would cross multiple buildings, multiple regions. So in the end, the result is that we would have an industry-wide interoperable standard, a resilient framework. We can securely manage our BAS and OT systems as if they were IT systems, supporting the IT infrastructure and best practices. And furthermore, being able to support not just small single commercial buildings, but also multi-site global portfolios. transition back to.
Thanks, Glenn. So I wanted to summarize things, and then we'll take a few questions that have come in along the way. You know, in summary, right, we covered the concept that significant operational opportunities exist with modern control systems, especially when they're connected. The world is evolving, right? We're not installing a controller and leaving it for 20 years anymore. The world is evolving, and we need to evolve with it to make sure we stay on top of cybersecurity. We talked through, you know, some of the core ideas of teaming and secure product and installation practices, and then obviously maintenance along the way. We also highlighted very clearly, right, that ownership is a really, really key important item here. That can be difficult on you know, scenarios where maybe we have a relationship with a contractor in the front end and then, you know, don't have a direct relationship with the customer on the back end. And so we have to make sure that we're getting to that customer as quick as possible, right? It's not always immediately as a part of the upfront work, but it certainly needs to happen very quickly after turnover. The last thing that I want to highlight, right, is that the change is accelerating. And so, you know, you saw the executive order. There's a whole lot of things that are coming out of that. There are federal IoT standards. There are privacy standards that are coming, you know, both from within the U.S. and without. The change is accelerating. And, you know, I want to continue to impress upon the fact that there is not going to be one person that's going to know the answers to all of these things. You're going to need to partner, right, with owners, with engineers, with suppliers. All of us are going to have to be a part of the conversation in order for us to be successful. And so with that, I saw someone had transitioned to the Q&A slide. Let's go ahead and head there for the last 9 minutes of our allotted time.
Then go ahead and enter it in the question box, and we'll get started. Okay, Brian, starting for a question for you, do you think BACnet over SC will be quickly adopted by our HVAC commercial community?
That's a really good question. Thank you for the question. But what I would say is this, right? It is something that we all want, right? From a manufacturing standpoint, from a consulting engineering standpoint, it simplifies a lot of our lives. However, there are still some challenges for us to ultimately successfully deploy it. Number one is, you know, getting manufacturers with independent validations of successful product, right? Getting product through the BTL process, that is the BACnet Test Labs process, critically important. Number two is having people understand in the community what it means for legacy systems to coexist with these new BACnet secure systems, Secure Connect systems. And so I think there's a lot of really good prior art. I would point to some of the webinars on this very site. There's a lot of really good places for people to catch up on BACnet Secure Connect. There is an all hands-on, right, press from many manufacturers. As you go out to that acceleration interoperability website, you will see a significant number of manufacturers that are committed to this. They're committed to it in quick order. We need to drive specifications. We need to drive awareness. I have every faith that it'll happen. However, there are some hurdles for us to get from here to broad distribution and installation. And so I appreciate the question. Not a silver bullet, right? But there is a lot of push behind it, a lot of really good things that will come from it if we can collectively push it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brian. Mangaya, this next question is for you. So you spoke a bit about teaming, and I would love to get your thoughts. When a new BAS system is sold and installed at a facility, who is liable for the security breaches?
That's a great question, and it's an interesting fact, right? There are a couple things we wanted to make sure. So first things, if you're installing a a new system in your in a customer network, we want to make sure what are the terms and conditions we have there with the customer, right? Who's responsible? It's very important since it's not just one person owning the liability here. We want to make sure we clearly define the ownership, who owns what and what needs to be done, right? So depending upon the terms and conditions, if you have committed with the terms and conditions saying that, yep, this is a system, being a contract manufacturer or the facility manager, I own the responsibility to periodically patch them and everything, then you have some liability hook on that. At the same time, and if it's a cyber incident that happened in a customer network and you're one of the BAS system being one easy target and being an intrusion point, then it'll come back to it'll link there depending upon the terms and condition. It may follow to the offering team or to the business of the customer. So it's not a real good answer, yes and no. There's always a gray spot here because more regulations and more legal commitments and the language is what we have in place dictates who owns the exact risk. But overall, to your answer, it'll be shared ownership and shared liability across both the teams here.
Great answer. Thank you, Mangaya. Back to you, Brian. Is the current best practice for building automation systems to live on the owner's network behind their firewall or on its own BAS network separated from the owner's network?
That's a really good question, and I would say the answer depends. I hate that answer, but I'm going to give it anyways. It depends on how engaged the IT staff is. If you have an engaged IT staff that is responsible for deploying and maintaining the IT network and is responsible for maintaining firewalls and VLANs, right? Then I think you defer, right? You defer to what they're comfortable with. Each organization is likely to have their own policy and their own standards around cybersecurity within the organization. Isolation is the key, whether it's done with a physical isolation, separate network, or whether it's done to the satisfaction of an IT resource using technology, right? Virtual networks and other types of solutions. I think the answer depends, right? And the key again goes back to talking to the IT staff. The IT staff doesn't exist, right? It's probably wise to err on the side of complete separation if possible. That may not be viable given the specifics of the contractor situation, but if that is possible, that is the ideal, although it could increase costs, right? And so, again, we want to defer to IT if they're involved.
Wonderful. Thanks, Brian. Okay, Glenn, this one's for you. How do you implement automatic updates without a password being required? Glenn, are you on? If not, can Brian or Mangaya answer?
Yeah, I can take it. So
okay,
one of the things that I would say we're a ways off from is automatic updates, right? Automatic updates are problematic for some of the reasons I laid out, as well as others that we didn't discuss. I would say the key is around scheduled updates, right? Working a scheduled process into a plan. It's really hard, right, to think about the scenario where you've got a service account that's pushing updates and an owner doesn't know or doesn't agree or isn't aware of. And so the core idea needs to be about scheduling a window. Ultimately, whether that window of time when the update is done, it requires a technician to actually have admin access and remotely update a file, or there's a mechanism that a manufacturer has deployed to do the remote update with some sort of service account. The key is transparency, right? We don't want to get to a point where technicians are emailing around usernames and passwords because email isn't secure. And so the key is to start with a window, to start with an owner, right? And then the how eventually is going to, it's going to migrate over time, right? It's going to migrate from a manual site to or trip to the site via a truck or remote access into the facility, all the way up to at some point in the future scheduled or automatic updates as manufacturers have that ability and agreement and approval from customers.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brian. I think that's all we have about a minute left, so I'm going to pause with question and answer for there. Don't worry if you did get submit a question. We'll be following. We'll have the panelists follow up via email after the webinar over the next week or so. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. If you'd like to learn more or be contacted by someone within Trane to learn more, feel free to go out to trane.com/controls. You'll see a form on that page. You're more than welcome to fill out and just say you're looking for more information on cybersecurity. And if you scroll down right below that form on that page, you'll see a new section of our website dedicated to cybersecurity, with a great best practices guide for you to download. So thank you so much for joining today. And that's our webinar.